not gone forward with those cases. There have been acquittals. There have been acquittals in some very politically controversial cases. And like Mo Davis, the former prosecutor of the military commission, said, well, in the military commissions, we're not going to have acquittals. In the federal courts, you can expect to have acquittals. You can expect to have judges that will have the independence and courage necessary to acquit people who are being unfairly prosecuted. And I do believe you have strict standards of evidence, much stricter than what you see in the military commission system.
My question is in regards to the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Except. Slavery is not completely abolished, except. Can you comment on this and maybe think if there's a link between the 13th Amendment and today and our prosecution of people like Guantanamo? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think you're maybe pointing to the larger problem of just, very repressive and inhumane conditions, not only at Guantanamo, but in our federal prisons. And Human Rights Watch is actually releasing a report next week about supermax conditions at Guantanamo. And in case people in this room aren't familiar with that term, there are a bunch of super maximum security prisons in the United States, and those conditions have now been replicated at Guantanamo. Super maximum security prisons are prisons in which people are held 22 or 23 hours a day in solitary confinement in their cells. They are brought out once a day to exercise in a solitary way in a small sort of chicken run. So they essentially spend their lives alone. This is a problem within the United States. I think Human Rights Watch has released a number of reports about these prisons within the United States. This is an even worse problem at Guantanamo in that at least prisoners in supermax conditions in the United States are allowed a minimum number of family visits and family phone calls. There are prisoners at Guantanamo who've spent 6 years in U.S. custody without ever being able to make a phone call home to their families. No prisoner at Guantanamo has ever received a family visit. There are prisoners at Guantanamo who are illiterate, so although they're allowed to write letters to their families, that is small consolation to someone who can't write and can't read. So, what we're hoping, of course, is that Guantanamo is going to close soon, but in the meantime, we're going to be calling for the very dramatically bad conditions of confinement there to be improved.
Hi, two questions, but they're short ones. I wanted to be clear, when you talked about the proposed laws for preventative detention, is that for enemy combatants or you're talking about criminal suspects in the regular civilian court system?
There's a variety of proposals, but most of them would simply cover suspected terrorists. Now, the United States government, or the current administration, calls terrorists enemy combatants, but there are many people who want to leave that paradigm behind. They don't, I think it's associated with the Bush administration. Many people believe it's been a mistake to call this a war against terrorism. It's sort of wrongly elevated the status of people who engage in terrorist activity by calling them sort of the enemy rather than calling them criminals. So I think most of these proposals would drop the enemy combatant paradigm, but they would simply allow the preventive detention of terrorist suspects.
Okay, my second question real quickly is here in Virginia, a federal judge allowed the tortured testimony of Abu Ali, and who was supposedly plotting to murder George Bush and was tortured into saying so by the Saudis, and the same judge refused to allow the jury to hear where the confession came from. And I wonder if you believe that that undercuts the war party's argument that we cannot try these people in civilian court here because torture testimony will not be allowed. Thank you very much.
That's also, like the Padilla case, that's a very good case to point out. Abu Ali, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's an American citizen who was arrested in Saudi Arabia. And his parents filed suit in the United States alleging that he was being held in Saudi Arabia at the behest of the American government. He was later extradited to the United States for trial, and his counsel claimed that he had been abused while in Saudi custody and that confessions had been obtained abusively. The court allowed testimony by human rights observers and experts on the Saudi system to show that, in fact, torture is prevalent in Saudi Arabia, and there's a strong likelihood that those statements were obtained abusively. But the court, and I'd emphasize that in the federal courts, when there's a prima facie case made that evidence was obtained abusively, the burden is on the prosecution to show that it wasn't. So it's actually a heavy burden to get these testimonies entered into evidence. But in any case, in that case, the court did not find that the statements were obtained abusively, and they weren't allowed into court. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. I wasn't, I'm not necessarily going to second guess the court's decision, but I agree with you that that case raises some concerns.
My question pertains to the Uyghurs and people in the same category that you mentioned.
Yeah.
These people evidently are not even candidates for prosecution by Guantanamo standards. So it would appear that after having been held under terrible conditions for years, the United States owes these people something. The United States government has committed a grave wrong against these people by holding them all this time in violation of all our own ideas of justice. So I'm wondering what possible reason U.S. authorities could give for denying asylum to Uyghurs or others in this same category. We admit people all the time to asylum in this country, even though the United States government may not be at fault in endangering them or harming them in the beginning. But in this case, the U.S. government is the cause of their harm and definitely owes them some form of restitution.
Well, I absolutely agree with you there. But as I mentioned, these are people, the Uyghurs included, because the United States spokesmen were speaking just in generalizations. These are people that were deemed the worst of the worst, the most dangerous men on earth. I think it was Rumsfeld who said that they might chew the hydraulic lines on the airplanes when they were brought to Guantanamo, and therefore they had to be subject to such, incredible constraints. So after you've told the world that these people are, terrifying, it would take a lot of courage to then say, well, we made a mistake. They're not the worst of the worst. In fact, they're not bad at all, and we're going to resettle them into the United States. Now, I'm hoping that the next administration is not going to be wedded to the failures of this administration, and that it will be easier for them to turn the page. I don't see, George Bush is kind of notoriously bad at admitting mistakes. Nobody else in this administration is particularly good at admitting mistakes. It may be easier for a future president to say, this has been a mistake. The Uyghurs, by next January, the Uyghurs will have been held about 7 years. We owe them resettlement in the United States. For that matter, I would say that we owe them some kind of compensation as well, and we may owe several hundred people who've been returned to their home countries without as much as an apology, some kind of compensation. And there I note that one of the many pernicious things in the Military Commissions Act of 2006, which was passed in response to, I think, a very good decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, is that it bars former enemy combatants from going to U.S. courts to seek compensation. So the government has thought about the fact that it sort of, in principle, owes these people some kind of compensation, and it has explicitly barred that avenue of relief.
Thank you.
Thanks.